So the first of our presentations will about caring, so meet caring of the data. And I'm very, very glad to introduce a person that is really very, very experienced in that field, David Zaccagnini from Boston. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. It might be that it's Davide and not David, but
you did a great job.
Okay, thanks.
One of the few actually who gets it.
Reading your CV, this is really impressive. You started with a residency in vascular surgery, so your background is medicine, and then you did a master's in biomedical informatics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Then you were a research fellow and research assistant at MIT and Harvard Medical School, and then have a lot of experience with industry as consultant in Eclipses Corporation, as a vice president in Language and Computing Corporation, as director in medical informatics in Nuance Communication, and biomedical research advisor in Lynkeus, and you are eventually founder and CEO of Agora Labs. So we appreciate very much your experience in that field, also in translation of research in really application that can be used in routine, and it's worth. So please give us an insight in your consideration about ethical and legal governance for data sharing and AI in cancer imaging. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Indeed, you know, all this long story, if anything, shows the fact that I've seen the problem of sharing data in medical research from many different angles. Indeed, I started thinking that the problem was just making better decision-making systems for medicine, then realizing that you're not going to develop artificial intelligence if you don't have the data. And that's where the complexity really began. And going back to one of the slides Karim was sharing, I have to say that he sort of glided through that initial step, defining how the legal framework for the project was established. But his slide was not telling the whole truth in a way, because if you really look behind the scenes at what that legal framework really is, you immediately have a clear visual understanding of the complexity of that whole process. So I'm not even talking about the time it took, because a lot of the studies in legal and ethical compliance for data sharing are fairly mature and give all the underpinnings that you need in order to create a compliance framework. But when it comes to actually implementing that framework, this is the typical situation that you face. We have 7 different data processing and other types of agreements that have to be established and signed in the project in order to realize the type of data sharing that is needed to deliver the results that we set for ourselves. And you know, the 8th document is the instructions to understand how these documents should be managed, to be instantiated and signed. So if you look at, you know, why this is the case, why you need so much work in so that data can be shared, the real problem is privacy, as we very well in return, is that it's a very vague concept. There are very few formal definitions of what privacy is. The GDPR does not provide a formal definition of privacy. The way they express it is anything that cannot be re-identified using state-of-the-art technology is private, but it doesn't say what re-identification really means or what state-of-the-art technology really is. In the age of artificial intelligence, it's basically infinite power of inference that can be brought to re-identify patients in any given database. And that's why many studies conducted in the US and in Europe actually demonstrate that anonymization or de-identification is really not a viable concept. There is just so much that you can infer from even an anonymized database uh, that basically makes the whole concept in a way moot. The US are more crisp in their definition of privacy because there are specific identifiers that they list, and once you take them out of a database, you're considered the data considered to be anonymized. But in reality, you can always cross-match the internal information in the database or with external databases and basically re-identify everybody in the data set. And this, by the way, is a big problem in the industry as well. You know what probably Apple did recently, and with their new privacy measures, it was a very laudable effort, but it create definitely rift in the industry that are still not entirely resolved. So if you bring this to imaging data, you see that the problem is even more pressing, because let's say that you have alphanumeric data sets that you can maybe applying HIPAA or maybe applying advanced anonymization in the European territories. You can strip the identifiers off and then claim that the data are re-identified. But if you're dealing with images, then it's extremely complicated. Images are the identity of someone in the very raw state. It's a picture of you. And when it comes to, for instance, images of head, which in the oncology case, it's frequent because one of the main indicators for head MRIs or head CT are either neurovascular accidents or cancer. So multiple scans are taken in oncology patients with brain tumors at regular intervals. And from one of these images, you can easily reconstruct the actual face of the patient, the most re-identifiable aspect of someone's identity. Now, there are tools that are brought to bear that deface these images. There are some promising efforts in this area. It's a fairly complex machine learning task that it's still not mainstream as a way of anonymizing images, but in a way doesn't even solve entirely the problem. If you move to other body areas, such as the chest or the abdomen, there are sometimes very identifiable marks, such as the presence of a pacemaker, of which you can actually read the serial number, which is uniquely identifying that device for that patient in any kind of chest X-ray. So the problems that are still dear in the area of alphanumeric data or free text data, when it comes to imaging, really get to a whole new level of complexity. And just to reinforce what this is causing, privacy is not simply the need for being compliant with the law. It is not a simple technical step. Privacy is the bottleneck that affects all other downstream tasks for whoever is dealing with medical data. Privacy makes it so that I cannot even know if the other center I want to partner with has the data I'm actually looking for. Privacy stops me from understanding exactly the value of the data, or to actually give someone access to the data so that the data can be curated, including the anonymization. There has to be a data processing agreement that is established even before somebody can go and anonymize the data, unless that person is authorized by the organization. Even if I solve the privacy from a legal standpoint, I never know exactly what is the risk of re-identifying those patients once I start distributing the data. So it's really a bottleneck that chokes data flows at the origin. And as Karim knows very well, we have been pushing very hard on each of the data centers in EuCanImage so that they could allow data access from other consortium members. But this has been, as it always is, a steep uphill battle. Now, when everything goes well, just to give you an idea, these are the steps that are typically performed before the data can be even shared. And it takes months to years to do so. So you understand what the general impact is. Now, how do you really, fortunately, there are good news in the industry and in the research arena. One of the most promising solutions to actually develop data sets that are both useful from a research and technology development standpoint, but at the same time, they can truly maintain privacy, is the generation of synthetic data. This is getting a lot of attention in many different fields of medicine, but also outside of medicine. And it has a specific set of challenges when it comes to imaging data because of their nature, the high density of the information in each image. Most cases, when you generate images synthetically, you want them to be high definition, which has a lot of computational challenges. It's extremely intense from a CPU standpoint to generate these images. There are also other challenges in terms of representing type of fill gaps in the original distributions. The typical example is negative cases, which are the minority, indeed, in many radiology populations, because of course the indication is based on a suspected disease, so that happens in more cases to actually be true than negative exams. So to fill up the gaps in these distributions, there are new advanced methods that allow images to be composed out of different patterns that are matched and sort of patched together with mechanisms such as attention mechanism. So this is very promising, not only because it allows to create images that are still useful, but did not relate to any specific patient and therefore are private, but also because with new type of algorithms, you can actually inject specific privacy protection mechanisms inside these synthetically generated images, such as differential privacy, which actually gives a mathematical guaranteed of the risk of potentially re-identifying patients by attempting to attack with deep inferences the synthetic data. If with some advanced AI solutions, it's actually possible to reconstruct how the generative algorithm that created the synthetic data actually got to that creation. And from there is a risk that the attacker could actually understand something about the underlying original data that the algorithm used. Now, with differential privacy, you minimize this risk so that the resulting synthetic data are not only useful, but they are actually quantifiably private. This is a very important type of innovation that, in a way, would avoid the entire complexity that I was showing earlier. If you truly have privacy and scalable anonymity using solutions such as, again, differentially private synthetic data, this whole complex diagram I'm showing will really be mostly disappearing. in reality, under the licensing agreement, if you're sharing truly anonymous data. The GDPR is clear that if it's not personal, if it's not sensitive, you don't even need to have legal coverage. And I want to finish this presentation with just maybe a note of optimism, because this whole new world of privacy for data started really in 2018 with the GDPR, but the European Commission was smart in also funding right away at the same time a lot of research in private distributed ecosystems powered by technologies such as blockchain or federated learning. And so while the GDPR definitely imposed a heavy weight on both research center and organizations who wanted to share data, they also funded research to mitigate the problem that they were creating with the GDPR. And the idea of federated learning came from those research projects, and so did synthetic data. So in a way, things are improving. Now, even more, from June this year, things are even changing on the regulatory side. The Data Governance Act is really a big news, and I would say a game changer in terms of the type of provisions that it introduces, especially that of data intermediaries, which are essentially brokers of data transactions that are tasked with guaranteeing privacy, but actually are also certified to do so by the European Commission itself. So there is a much more streamlined process by which, if I don't have the capability to share my data in a compliant way, I can go to one of these intermediaries and contract with them, and they can get paid for the services they offer. This is important because until you really talk about incentives, people and organizations typically don't move. So while the future is definitely a future where privacy is here to stay, not only in Europe, not only in the US, but I was talking to an Indian colleague earlier today who told me that in India, they're about to pass a law that is very similar to the GDPR. China has done the same. And this is to say that with the right technology, while privacy is established as a universal human right, these new frameworks do not necessarily need to stop the flow of data, but with technologies such as synthetic data or federated learning, you can actually have the best of both worlds. True privacy protection, but also a rich data ecosystem for biomedical innovation. And with that, I conclude, and I don't know if we're taking questions now or we're waiting for the end. Either way, I'm happy to abide.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation of this highly innovative and very sensitive topic that we have. We all deal with these problems, and you have also given some solutions that are possible nowadays. So I look here on the chat. I don't see any questions so far from the audience. Then I would like to ask the panel now. How do you handle this sensitive issue at your institution? So we always also here try to think about how can the images really be defaced or not. So you have shown software how you could deface images. So let me ask the panel, who of you is using some of these systems already? Please go ahead. Probably Emanuele. Well, what are your experience with that? Yeah.
Yes, my experience, I would say, is very bad. I think Karim and the other guys from the EuCanImage know that in Pisa we are facing with a lot of problem in having the approval from the hospital to use the patient's data. We are in the process, of course, to manage with the hospital an agreement to allow the upload of the data for the EuCanImage platform. But the main problem we have with this, with the hospital, is what Davide said. He said that 99% of anonymized records can be re-identified. I think this is one of the main questions they ask. So are these data re-identifiable? And we unfortunately, we can only say yes, of course, because you can. I saw the slides that Davide showed about the MR exam, where you can have a, or the case of the pacemaker, or the case of a 3D exam, 3D of the brain, where you can recognize the patient. So, of course, the data are identifiable. So the only let's say solution that they ask to us that can solve the problem is the patient informed consent that can allow to use the data. But having the patient informed consent is quite difficult, especially if you are going to collect retrospective data, as we are doing in EuCanImage or in many other projects. So think about the patients that had breast cancer and she died. She died for the breast cancer. So what you do, patients where you have collected the data 10 years before or 5 years before, you call it home, you find the relatives and you ask for using the data. So it's quite difficult from an ethical point of view to collect the data. And this is the main barrier we are facing with our hospital, and so I think that it's not easy to solve, actually, not easy to solve.
Yeah,
so I brought my experience, actual personal experience in the EuCanImage.
Oh, absolutely, Emanuele, this is a very good point. Indeed, that is the status quo. Again, I want to cast a note of optimism. There are technologies nowadays that, if used in an integrated fashion, actually do meet the gaps that you're indicating. One is, for instance, blockchain. So there are multiple experiences, and I want to spend a couple of words on our past experience in the My Health, My Data project, out of which my company actually emerged, Agora Labs. Was one of the first experience where blockchain was used for informed consent. And Emanuele is perfectly right when you say that, once a patient signed a piece of paper 3 years earlier, and now you want to use the data for something else, go and fetch that patient and ask him again to re-sign another piece of paper. It's just impossible. But mobile apps talking to a blockchain, where you can just send an alert and tell that patient, look, there is an interesting research study that actually may have benefit for you because of your disease. Could you please add this study to your consent so that we can access your data? It's not entirely solving the problem, but adds a level of efficiency that in the status quo just doesn't exist. So if you start thinking about the whole compliance chain, from informed consent to permissioning of the data access, to protecting privacy after the consent has been given, because consent is not really the only thing that you need to have. You also need to minimize the information that you share, even if consent was given for that use. Still, the GDPR tells you that you shouldn't be sharing more than what is strictly needed for that study. But you can do that with either synthetic data or privacy-preserving federated learning. So the good news is that these technologies are now available. Though, of course, it will take years for every hospital in Europe to implement them, but solutions are there to be used, and they're fairly mature. So again, I think this is similar to what happened with electronic medical records in the past. They were there, people were trying to sell these systems to the hospitals. Hospitals were not buying them because of money, because of bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And maybe what happened in the US in that sense is a good reference. For electronic medical record, the US government actually started sponsoring directly with a program called Meaningful Use, the adoption of electronic medical records that were certified, and therefore hospitals were incentivized to actually purchase them. And maybe something similar needs to happen in this space. You know, data platforms, distributed data platform that preserve privacy need to be, you know, a mainstream type of asset that everybody should have, much like they have PACS systems or lab systems. Nobody is questioning whether they should have it or not. So maybe some institutional push could be an idea here.
We do have one question from the audience, and this is, what's the added value of using blockchain for a more informed consent instead of a more regular database? Could you comment on this?
Yeah, very good question. Blockchain is public, and it's immutable, and it's distributed. What that does is, if I change my consent because someone asked me to, the blockchain records this event in a public way that nobody can ever change. It's immutable, right? And everybody exercise control over the transactions following shared rules on the blockchain. You can, of course, do it privately, but the level of transparency and therefore auditability is much lower, because if I have a proprietary system that manages consent for my patients, I own that system. I control that system. As an institution, you know, you don't need to necessarily suspect maliciousness, but it's always inside my firewall, and I only give access to who I want. There is less transparency. The blockchain infrastructure allows full auditability of every event that is registered on it by definition. And in that sense, is not necessarily a better solution from a computational standpoint, but it is from a compliance standpoint.
One question that I would like to add, what about the safety of the data of the blockchain?
Yeah.
Would you have any concerns whether this could be hacked, and anybody else could have access? I mean, they have the data within their own firewall is much more safer, but the ethical committees and data protector, they always say, yeah, don't lose their own wall. So what is your
so one principle that has been now, I would say, emerging, I would say it's more kind of becoming already a best practice when it comes to blockchain in healthcare, is that you never put the data, the patient data, on the blockchain. But that would be, you know, too risky. So the blockchain in healthcare, but in other industries as well, I suppose, is not really a way of storing data or sharing data. Is only a way of exposing to a community that wants to know what data are available and what are the criteria for accessing these data. What these criteria are. It's simply a way of publishing metadata that facilitates the data flows and that control data access. Through smart contracts, one person can say, I want only, you know, public research projects to leverage my data. I don't want my data to be used by pharmaceutical companies who do animal experimentation. Blockchain allows that level of flexibility by which you can specify whatever is your institutional or personal preference regarding who accesses your data. That's all that actually appears. Your data remain in your personal storage or behind your firewall if you are a hospital. It's only the access layer that is managed through the blockchain. That's a very important principle.
Okay, interesting, very interesting. Do you use it already? Oh, this is in use?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, okay. This is one of the integrated components in our platform. And I'm not talking about only my company. I'm talking also about a project that we're closing called Kraken, which is really a data marketplace. It's using the same principle of permissioning through the blockchain and federated learning in a privacy preserving fashion. And we're just really winding the project down. It was a very interesting one. Feel free to check out. It's kraken.eu, I think is the website.
Thank you. Now, let me know also the experience from the other members of our panel. Probably Magdalena, would you comment on this? What is your experience with this sensitive issue?
Sure. For those that don't know me, my name is Magdalena Kogut-Czarkowska, and I'm a Timelex lawyer, and I'm working on Incisive, which is a sister project, if you will, because we are in the same cluster of projects in the area of imaging and artificial intelligence. When I was listening to David's presentation, I had a flashback because a lot of the issues that he was discussing, we had to tackle, of course, as well. I wanted to say maybe 3 points to comment on 3 points that he was mentioning, and to say how we are handling these issues in Incisive. So Incisive, indeed, we tackled we had to tackle this question about the anonymity of data and the identification of data. And I would say that my experience is that there is a great deal of miscommunication between the healthcare professionals, between technical partners, between ethics committees on what is anonymization. I think nobody really wants to, and that's clear for everyone, that the researchers do not need data that has the name of the patient. That is clear. And for some, already removing the name of the patient and removing the number of the patient, a social security number, that's enough, and that we have anonymous data. Whereas when we look at it from the perspective of GDPR, we clearly know, especially that we are exporting medical data with a medical record on a history of somebody's illness, medical images, metadata attached to this image, that it cannot be sufficient to just remove these basic direct identifiers. So we have to go into the discussion on how much data we have to remove from this patient file to make it de-identified, to make it unidentifiable from the perspective of the researcher, and whether we can even reach this threshold of anonymity. And my perspective, and that's my take, that it's really difficult to say with confidence that the data is anonymous, especially that we really have to take into account the context in which the data will be used. If the data will be used in a very closed environment, so there are technical and organizational measures which limit the people that have access to that data, and also limit whether it can be copied, whether it can be even viewed, then perhaps we can talk about anonymity in that context. But if the data, if then we take the confidence to say, well, now we have anonymous data and we export it and make it public to the world, the same data may become re-identified by malicious actors, but by researchers that have access to other data. And it is, well, there is a lot being said, and there are a lot of legal documents written on how to interpret this anonymity, and whose perspective, is it objective, is it relative, what are those reasonable means to re-identify the data. It's an ongoing discussion, and I think this is very much hindering that there's no lack of clarity, there are no concrete guidelines. This is really hindering the discussion between different hospitals and partners in exchanging the data. And I've said this many times, that I think it is perhaps sometimes better to acknowledge that we cannot reach this full anonymity, but we can do our best to de-identify the data, to code it, to minimize the amount of data that is there, but then to think about the technical and organizational and different measures to secure that data so it will not be leaked, it will not be misused, it will not be re-identified. So to put that privacy in the context in which the data will be used. So that's the comment on the de-identification or anonymization. I would like to also clarify from the legal standpoint, because we had a bit of a different experience with claiming our retrospective data from the hospitals involved in Incisive. We had to, of course, go into discussions on whether they would be willing to contribute the data to the repository and to make this data available to the AI researchers, even though we cannot promise them that this data will be permanently anonymized. And in fact, in the research project that we are working, we thought whether it makes sense to permanently anonymize the data. Because, for example, if there is a patient that is there is a treatment that is ongoing, there needs to be an update to the file of this patient. So perhaps some data that is initially taken from this patient then needs to be updated as the project progresses. So if we permanently anonymize that data at the beginning, then it won't be possible to add new data to that file. So again, I don't think anonymization and sort of pushing for it at all cost is the right answer. Sometimes it's better to say we have de-identified the data, we have pseudonymized it, but we have some guarantees in place. And in our discussions, we had to go through that concept with the ethics board. We had to also discuss that with the European Commission, who at first was also requiring us to explain why we do not, for example, obtain consent for all the retrospective data. But what we did, we relied on different provisions, because in GDPR, there are different provisions on which you can rely for the legal basis for processing data. It can be consent, and consent can be appropriate in some settings. But for retrospective data, if some hospital is actually pulling data from many years ago, and these patients might be deceased, may have even moved on with their life and do not want to be reminded of again, the trauma of the treatment that they underwent, that can be a challenge to reach out to them and try to obtain that consent. And it can be re-traumatizing, in fact. So while for the prospective studies, indeed, we went with the consent. For retrospective data, and in some areas, we had to look for alternatives. And the problem currently is that we have GDPR and we have also national laws, and that needs to be looked at through the lens of national laws. And some jurisdictions are more restrictive, some are more permissive in respect to research use. So that is quite a complex topic, indeed, and a challenging one. Going forward, and that's the third point, David mentioned Data Governance Act, but we are also now discussing European Health Data Space, which is a regulation that perhaps will be enacted in some future. It's right now in the works, but that will be a deal changer in fact when it comes to sharing medical data. So I think that is something that we need to keep our eyes on, what are the developments in that area, because then that will give us additional layer of legal obligations, but also legal permissions to share data. if that's, I could go on and on probably and talk about different ways or different challenges we tackled and the different agreements we had to put in place and different documents we produced. But so if anyone is interested, I'm happy to elaborate. But perhaps Marius would also want to talk about his project. So I'm going to be silent now and listen to him.
But Magdalena, thank you really very much. You have a lot of experience and gave us a deep insight. So before Marius is talking, I just want to have one question. Are you aware of a lawsuits by patients that they claim that their data have been misused? I mean, we talk a lot about the rights of the patients, and are you aware that already patients claimed that their data have been re-identified and they they have now any disadvantages because of that?
It's hard to say. There were some sort of scandals in different countries about misuse of data. Indeed, I don't know, even to mention Cambridge Analytica case, but I don't think that, at least it's not my experience, that the patients are particularly litigious when it comes to scientific research. Of course, if there is an issue about misuse of their data for some other purpose, especially in commercial setting, and they were not aware, that is a triggering risk. But I wouldn't say it's something that we are really experiencing, that the patients are challenging these purely scientific projects, especially that are very carefully thought through and conducted within the framework of the European Horizon projects.
Right. Yeah, Marius, would you also like to give your insight from you? Probably also a few words about you, where you are located and what's your position.
Okay, so I'm Marius Mayerhoefer. I'm a professor of radiology at Memorial Sloan Kettering and Cornell University. And listening to Magdalena, I was amazed because what she described, also in a positive way, how, for instance, the GDPR can be interpreted and how it can be worked with, that really mirrored my experience with doing a project that I recently finished, a very large data project involving PET-CT images between the US and a European center. It at first, basically, when I thought, so we'll have to deal with GDPR for data sharing with the US in particular, that would create a huge amount of issues. And I mean, it does add a level of complexity. It's just basically a layer in between, but it did not make the whole project impossible. And we were actually able to do that. But just as Magdalena pointed out, it just had to be made sure that really only the relevant data would be submitted. And it was a lot of the processes involved making sure that the transmission of data and the storage of data and the access to the data was secure, was limited. There was also a deadline basically put on how long the data can be stored in a secure folder, and then they would have to be deleted, which is actually good because it also like pushes us to carry on with the research. But it's not that GDPR makes data sharing impossible. I just want to point that out from a practical point of view. It just adds a level of complexity. Sometimes that there are misunderstandings between, for instance, the IT security personnel. So when I had the PET-CT data anonymized, two of the DICOM tags that were basically auto-removed were the patient weight and the injected radiotracer dose. And that, as you know, that renders PET data basically unusable. So that had to be, I mean, I just had to explain why these data are necessary. But basically, those were the only two DICOM tags, for instance, that were really important for that study, because at some point they had to be normalized to a particular range of standardized uptake values. But other than that, the process, yes, it took some time, but it was successful. And yeah, I do not see, it seems to me that there is also a lot of interpretation, and I think Magdalena hinted at this, that GDPR seems to be interpreted, or maybe sometimes clashes with national law. Talking to my other European colleagues, I have the impression that the way GDPR is handled differs from country to country, and maybe, at least I was told, at least in Germany, also between the different states, if I understand correctly. So I guess there is some need for harmonization, especially if you want to do projects on a European or at least EU scale. Then there needs to be a level of harmonization for that, because otherwise repositories will never reach their full potential. That's my view on it.
Absolutely.
I just want to comment
on
that
David.
last. Yeah, I just want to comment on that last comment from Marius, which is very, very poignant. I think the two great bottlenecks to data flows are privacy and data quality, or data harmonization, the many flavors of basically providing somebody with the right type of data for the questions they want to answer. My feeling is that if you try to sequence these two problems, actually privacy comes first, meaning the problem of harmonizing data remains a challenge. It's a bit of a dark art, as we know, because it's about semantics and different formats, different standards. So it remains definitely an issue. But if you solve privacy, at the very least, you can have some direct access to the data that allow you to solve that problem. What's happening now is that you cannot even go to standardized data, which always requires some type of manual process, because you cannot access the data. So in this sense, yeah, there is kind of a first and second bottleneck.
Yeah, I would also raise one question, ask you, the panel, that is also, I think, quite important for the future. The one thing is that we do research, of course, then we evaluate the data, we write our papers and so on, and so far we are more or less safe and relatively in a relatively simple situation, I would say. It's not too simple, but it's still. But when we talk about approval of products, then probably we face another hurdle. And one question is in particular also, Davide, I would be interested in your opinion about that. If you would develop the same software in a country that don't has this kind of restrictions that we do have, would you be able to sell the software afterwards in our countries where we have more difficult hurdles to take? So wouldn't it be easier for a company like you to just say, okay, we collect our data in another country that is more simple to handle, and then just take the product out and get it approved in the US or Europe? What is the situation about that?
Yeah, no, very, very good question. So in a way, being born both as a technology and then as a company in Europe has been like that type of rough childhood that prepares you for, you know, a successful adult life, meaning Europe has the strictest privacy law in the world by a large margin. I'm talking a very large compared to the GDPR is, you know, I don't want to be offensive, but it's a bit of a joke. You know, you just take off the database all these So actually, the fact that we were, born and raised in Europe it's really a mark of reliability, of maturity, of excellence in a way. And going back to your question, the other part of your question, when it comes to translating the technology in other countries, again, this is the experience we are having. People kind of look up to us because we're GDPR compliant. But there is another very interesting side to that argument, which is cross-border data sharing is one of the most forbidden areas that you can think in terms of privacy. Although it happens, typically it happens in some ways that are not necessarily entirely transparent. But when it comes to formalizing data that could be accessed from the US to Europe, or even more from Europe, say, to Asian countries, it's basically impossible. And no data protection officer will ever allow that unless you have a very, very solid privacy protection infrastructure. And again, I'm going back to the positive notes. The technologies that now are available will allow cross-border data sharing, and that is an incredibly big opportunity, because in reality, we don't even know how many data are out there, because again, they're not exposed for privacy reasons. But my feeling is that there is so much that life science companies, researchers could actually use today, if only these data sources were made available from all the countries in the world. It will be a very long tail of very interesting data that will suddenly become available, and that would have a huge impact on medical innovation.
But please let me just question again. The one is, of course, that the data are shared cross-border. This is, of course, quite problematic. But I think about the situation that not the data are cross-border, but it's just the software. So that means the data of the patients, they are hidden in the algorithm. And so you cannot re-identify that. And you can say, I develop my software with the data in a country where I can much cheaper have the access to the data, and then I hide all the data in my algorithm, and then I bring the algorithm back and have it cheaper. Yeah. Marius, there's also something you wanna add to this?
Yes, actually, I wanted to add exactly to that point, because I noticed that's one of the strategies that's now being applied by many centers which develop algorithms. They are keen, obviously, on testing their data. And the easiest way to do that from a legal point of view, at least that's how I understand it, is to actually share the algorithm and not share the data, because then you have less of a problem, obviously, and it also gets the job done. The only problem that I see is the more confined you are in your data, and basically by that in your demographics, the less generalizable it would be to the global population. You know, I'm as many of you know, I'm a lymphoma person, and just looking at the distribution of different lymphoma types across the globe, it would be very difficult to properly train an algorithm just, for instance, let's say on Austrian data, because that might not be translatable to Asia, where you see many other types, or more frequently see other types of lymphoma than in Austria. That's the problem. And that's why the validation aspect, the external validation aspect is so important. But yes, I also noticed in conversations with other people that are in development of algorithms that at the moment there seems to be, it seems to be a good strategy to share the algorithm and not the data itself.
Okay, Magdalena.
A very quick legal note, that GDPR is construed in such a way that if you have a company in Europe, in the European Union, and you are processing data from other countries, so if you were to bring data from China, or even try to train your models on that data, that would also fall into the scope of GDPR. So it's not that easy. to escape, and so to say, okay, we're going to use the data from another country. So just a very, very short, it's a very big oversimplification, but I think it's good to raise a flag that it's not an easy way out to just import the data. And that's one comment, and two, and I know that we are running out of time, so just to flag, there's also a regulation that is being developed on AI, and there's a big discussion on how to document the data on which the training takes place and what quality of those data sets need to be fulfilled. So they need to be representative, which is one of the biggest challenges, how to make sure that this data set is representative and that the model is not biased because it was trained on data that is not representative to the data on which it will be used. So just to be aware of that circumstance as well.
So this is a very important point that you just raised. Let me just ask again to understand. Would it mean that a product, for example, from a nation country, will not get an approval in Europe until they can prove that they followed our GDPR rules?
Oh, it's not as simple
Okay.
as that, but certainly the whole discussion on how to certify medical device as medical devices, because I think we are talking about AI products that will be used by the healthcare professionals as a medical device, and there are different types of these devices. This is a big challenge, and a lot of investigation is going on in that respect, and that's not only about the privacy, but also exactly the fulfillment of the criteria of the data sets, and also some documenting on how this solution is accurate and reliable. But probably there are people that are better positioned to talk about this than myself.
Okay, thank you very much. Emanuele, you also want to shortly comment?
You know, I was commenting what also Marius said, but also Magdalena, coming to your questions about having a software that is trained in a country and then is used in another country. We had an evidence of that during the COVID pandemic. During the COVID pandemic and the first wave in Wuhan, there have been a rise of different companies from China that trained AI software for chest X-ray and chest CT with Chinese data. And so they came in Europe, especially in Italy, because we have the first pandemic wave. And they try to sell this software, or let's say also to offer for free. But of course, we are not confident about that because they have been trained with another population. So this is a problem, I think. Of course, you can train the algorithm, but if you train the algorithm with a specific patient population, you are not sure that the algorithm work at the same way in another population. Let's say COVID, of course, is quite an aspecific disease in terms of CT, lung manifestations, but considering other types of cancer, here we are talking about oncologic imaging, we are not sure that the same type of cancer that develop in China or in Japan can be, let's say, can have the same features that have a cancer developing in Europe or in US, depending on patient genetics, you know, environment, and so on. So it's a field to explore. So even if there is a problem from the privacy point of view, and I see, as Marius said, that the problem he took with the hands, the problem of having more facility, say, more easier to use the data in US, and he discovered how it was difficult to transfer the data in Europe, no? So because we have a stronger roots from this point of view. So the problem are different. So, but we already touched with our hands the problem during the COVID pandemic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank the whole panel for this lively discussion. It was very, very interesting, and I really would like to discuss with you for much more longer time on these very sensitive issues. And thank you very much, Davide, for your talk that inspired us all. And yeah, I think there's a lot to do. Still, we have to move on with our work on that.